Have you ever been told that self-diagnosis isn't valid, or that autistic people, self-diagnosed autistic people, are just jumping in on a TikTok trend? Well, you're not alone, because, hey friends, I'm Mike, a late identified autistic adult, and today we are going to look at the controversy around self-diagnosis of autism. Let's talk about diagnosis first. A couple of years ago, a really good friend of mine received some of the worst news that you could imagine. It was the big C, breast cancer. Her doctor gave her a diagnosis, a prognosis, and most importantly, a treatment plan. And it meant appointments, radiotherapy, chemo, trying on wigs for the first time, being tired, nausea, early retirement, the whole package. And I don't know how it started. Maybe it started with a symptom, a noticeable lump. Maybe it was caught in a routine screening. Either way, after tests and scans and a battery of tests the doctors confirmed what was happening inside her body. She had cancer. And with something like cancer, or even a relatively minor injury, like the rotator cuff tear that kept me from diving for most of 2024, you notice a problem. Then you consult a medical professional, get a diagnosis, and then ideally a solution. You need treatment to heal, or at the very least, to manage the condition. But autism isn't like that. Autism isn't a disease, it's not a mental illness, and it's definitely not something that you can cure. And that's why self-identification is such a big conversation. When somebody's autistic, they are autistic whether or not a doctor told them so. A diagnosis doesn't change what's already true, it just puts a label on it. Not everyone understands this. Remember when KSI wished an autistic fan to get well soon?
Do you know why he's not here?
Just couldn't come. He has Asperger's, like autism, so it wouldn't have been very good for him to come.
Oh, for real? Alright, well, I mean, hopefully you get well soon, and I'll see you guys in a bit.
Yeah, that's not how it works. I've been around on YouTube now for nearly 2 years, and in that time I've heard a lot of opposing views. I'm going to structure this video into 5 categories, with the most important bonus category at the end. There are chapter markers on this video so you can skip to the section that matters the most to you, and by the end of the video, you should have heard me answer as many of the self-diagnosis arguments, whether for or against. What is autism anyway? According to the National Autistic Society, autism is a lifelong developmental disability which affects how people communicate and interact with the world. The NHS says autism is not an illness, and then it details how autistic people might behave differently to allistic or non-autistic people. Both organisations try to dispel some of the main myths at the same time, such as links to intelligence and that every autistic person is of course different. If you're more inclined to think pathologically about autism, then the American Psychiatric Association has got you covered with Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD, refers to any one of a group of disorders with an onset typically occurring during the preschool years and characterised by difficulties with social communication and social interaction, along with restricted and repetitive patterns in behaviours, interests and activities. As I'm doing this with my hands and wiggling my legs. Anyway, American Psychiatric Association, you know how to talk sexy to us, don't you? There is not just one, but 2 typos in the first sentence of the definition. Maybe the APA need to employ an autistic person to proofread their website. Maybe. And if the APA isn't pathological enough a definition, you can go even further to Autism Speaks, who merged with the organisation Cure Autism Now, or CAN, back in 2007. On their website, on the page on autism cures and eugenics, let us be clear, they say, on our position around finding a cure for autism. They then say there is no cure for autism, because even though they're funding research into the causes of autism, autism has no known cause. I believe it's a natural variation of human neurobiology, but no matter what your opinions are, the facts are that autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition. There is no cure for it, but that doesn't stop people online arguing about how to best treat it, with a multi-billion-dollar-a-year behavioural therapy industry in the United States alone. I will be talking about ABA, or Applied Behavioural Analysis, in the future, so if you're new here, please stim the subscribe button and pop back to the channel every week or so, because for some reason YouTube decides to only show videos of channels that you're watching regularly, not ones that you've subscribed to and you want to see content from. So yeah, thanks for that, YouTube. Why people seek diagnosis. So if autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition and not a disease, why do people even want a diagnosis? Why does it matter? Now, for some people, the diagnosis is about validation, about having a professional confirm what they've already suspected. For others, it's about accessing specific support, things like disability accommodations, workplace protections, or even just understanding from family and friends, who, I'm sad to say, might not have believed you without the piece of paper. I'm really sorry to say that, but some people really do need to see a sheet of paper from a diagnostician before they'll believe you. And even then, a formal diagnosis can unlock legal protections, adjustments at school or work, or even financial aid in some cases. And sometimes just knowing can be a huge relief, rather than constantly feeling like you're struggling for no reason, that you're somehow broken. Now, legal protections are crucial for many autistic people, especially in the workplace. The Americans with Disabilities Act and similar laws in other countries protect diagnosed autistic people from discrimination and require employers to provide reasonable accommodations. These legal safeguards can make the difference between thriving at work and struggling unnecessarily. Although nobody wants to get to the point of having to rely on legal protections, the time you start citing legal protections, it might be a clue that your work environment is just that toxic. It might be better to be somewhere else, but like everything in life, that is easier said than done. Some specialised services only support formally diagnosed autistic people, so ones run by autism charities, for instance, not you, that might require a formal diagnosis before they can support you. But for me, getting a formal diagnosis is a huge relief. It was a massive relief. Instead of feeling like I was a broken neurotypical who had failed at life, well, if I hadn't been so lucky with my passions and interests, it meant that I could look back at my life through an autistic lens. Social burnout, masking, sensory overload, and realise that it wasn't my fault, if that makes sense. It's possible, by the way, to self-identify. In fact, before my autism assessment, I had a pretty solid idea that I was autistic from all of the reading and research that I'd done, but it helped to pick through it with a professional who was also highly experienced in working with autistic people. But I know that's my privilege. I paid for the assessment on my credit card and joined the long waiting list. I felt like an imposter, that I was wasting people's time. But then I didn't tell very many people at all at the time. I kind of kept it a secret. It is private after all. And everyone feels differently about this. Everyone has different variables to consider. One of my friends said when I told them that I wasn't autistic, that I just thought I was. My doctor said that I had a family and a home, so maybe I wasn't autistic, because autistic people, they both believed, have such severe struggles that they are unable to quote-unquote function, air quotes for people at the back. And for many people, getting an autism diagnosis isn't actually as simple as booking an appointment with a GP. A formal autism diagnosis can cost thousands of dollars, take years to get, and for most it's just simply out of reach. When I injured my shoulder though, my GP diagnosed and treated it on the spot. No extra specialists, no long wait lists, just a really big needle. But autism, that's a whole different story. In the UK, the NHS recommends that autism assessments involve a multidisciplinary team, or MDT. That might mean a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, a speech and language therapist, an occupational therapist, and maybe some others. In other countries, the process can be a little different, but the same theme is that it's rarely a quick, easy, or affordable process. The simple fact is that if you want an adult autism assessment, you generally have two paths. One is to contact your primary care doctor or GP and convince them to make a referral to specialist autism services. This is fraught with difficulties, both at the GP, depending on who they are, and where they refer you to. Your GP might dismiss you for having made a phone call or given eye contact. The wait list might be really long, a year maybe, 2 years, possibly. And when you get there, you might be speaking to a psychiatrist who last updated their autism knowledge in the early 1990s. It does happen, and in this field, alarmingly often. The other path is to refer yourself directly to a specialist clinic. If the clinic specialises in autistic adults and not general psychology services, you are more likely, I think, to get an up-to-date assessment that won't ask you to play with toys or tell a story about magical flying toads as an adult. They won't be looking into your supposed lack of empathy or theory of mind deficits. All myths. But they also have long wait lists. Still shorter than going the GP route. It is a financial privilege, and you might end up with the same clinic that the GP would have referred you to anyway, but you might then be seen in 6 to 9 months instead of 2 years. You'll also have to pay them yourself a large chunk of cash. I've said this now several times. It really is quite important. It's 4-figure dollars, right? 4-figure pounds. So that's 2 massive barriers right up front. If you're not able to afford your own assessment, or you've got an unhelpful GP, then you're going to be stuck. Before your assessment begins, you're going to be asked why you want one and why you think you might be autistic. You're going to be asked all about your childhood. Your assessor might want to speak to your family, your parents, get some history, maybe give them some forms to fill in. You might be asked to complete some screening questionnaires too in advance. In my experience, many of the autistic people I know have already gone into some deep research into all the ways that they might fit the criteria. They've kept and organised notes, they've made binders. I even made a mind map. And I had no idea at the time that it would then be on YouTube or that it would then be shared like thousands of times. But there you go. It feels kind of strange to be on this side of a screen for somebody else. And I know that you're out there watching me, preparing whether or not you even have an assessment booked. You're trying to figure yourself out, and that is perfectly okay, and you are not alone. It's also worth pointing out that there are significant cultural and gender biases towards being younger, white, and male, which means diagnosis is harder for many other groups that aren't younger, white, and male. The assessment pathway itself can be pretty traumatic. Medical gaslighting and being dismissed or disbelieved is unbelievably common. In fact, hot take, I think that if you're not younger, white, and male, I'd wager you're more likely than not to be medically gaslit as part of the process, and probably early on in the pathway. I hate to say it, but a certain resilience is needed just to get through the process, and it's not necessarily your fault if you aren't or don't feel capable enough to get through it on your own. This then creates a sort of survivorship bias towards people who have assessments because they've been able to get through the assessment. And maybe you have a trusted friend or family member that can support you if you need to go. Maybe you don't. Accuracy and misdiagnosis. Not all formal assessments are that accurate either. In fact, a commonly reported issue is that sometimes an autistic person, usually a woman, might be misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder, BPD, instead of autism. It is possible to be diagnosed, by the way, with both BPD and autism. It's approximately 10% kind of crossover there-ish. I'm not saying that it is, it's just that's what some research says. And about the last quarter of the time of my own autism assessment was actually looking through trauma and possible alternative explanations for my autistic traits. In that respect, a really comprehensive assessment led by somebody who has experience of how autism might look in women and non-white groups and cultures is particularly helpful, especially as the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and borderline overlap, and some explanations for autistic traits might have better explanations in those diagnoses. The simple fact, though, is that autism isn't a mental illness. Research shows that autistic people may be more likely to experience traumatic life events than the general population. Because environment. Environment is everything. And if your environment is like wearing 2 left shoes your whole life, then you might have some problems along the way. Now, imagine having been misdiagnosed, a bit like being forced into those shoes that don't fit you properly, and then having that fixed by an autism diagnosis later in life. And you don't have to imagine, because there's a lot of literature on this subject that you could read for weeks. Being treated for BPD can be harmful and promote masking in actually autistic, mostly women, but people. Being misdiagnosed can mean it's harder to access an autism assessment, and receiving that autism assessment result may be validating, reduce stigma, and improve mental health. Knowledge and expertise, legitimacy and recognition. Who is qualified to recognise autism? Do you need a doctor to tell you you're autistic? You don't need a doctor to tell you that you're gay, for example. Or can autistic people just recognise each other? It's really unfortunate that many professionals still rely on outdated stereotypes about autism and how they make their assessments or gatekeep the referral process. You can be a Harvard-trained, board-certified psychologist and still view autism as a linear spectrum from severely autistic to, well, normal, as they would say. I've spoken with several over the last year who have all said something that tells me that they have a level of autism knowledge somewhat less than you'd find on a large print flyer in a doctor's office. That's tragic, really. Autistic people often understand their own traits better than professionals do. Autism is an extremely varied condition, and if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. There is assessment criteria, and I've gone through one version of this in a previous video, but this assessment criteria and guidance notes Well, they are public. They're in the DSM, and a formal diagnosis is going to see if you meet the criteria or not, or what other explanations might be more appropriate, and to establish what your support needs are, if any. That's all they're going to do. You can do a large part of that work yourself. Quite a few people would argue that. The neurodiversity movement and online autism communities generally do recognise self-identified autistic people and allow them into their spaces. However, there are some places, like the fake disorder cringe and autistic peeps subreddits, that just aren't healthy. Their belief is that people are misidentifying themselves as autistic after having been influenced online. But I'm proud to say that in general, autistic people are very welcoming and validating of self-identification, particularly as this helps people to then find support and community. Gatekeeping who counts as autistic isolates people who need support and understanding, and it's always possible that someone might think they're autistic and be misinformed, sure, but spending time with autistic people is going to be a positive step for them. They'll learn more about the neurotype than maybe they ever expected to or wanted to. I found intense relief when I discovered my autistic identity. At the risk of sounding a little wanky and dramatic, it has been entirely life-changing. My video on profound autism from a couple of months ago, the idea that there is only one true autism, and that's when you have an IQ score of lower than 50, that's what makes it profound autism for some reason, and you are in residential care services. Well, that video attracted the attention of some autism moms. Now there's a group of people who have autistic children, and they're active online, and in general they are very dismissive of high-masking, late-identified autistic adults. And I know this because they're not shy, and they will tell me. Some of my parting words with my psychology services was to advise me to avoid those spaces. And they're right, because if you've ever tried to access any disability support services, or even have to have an accommodation made, you'll know how difficult it could be. For parents of autistic children, it can be really difficult, especially if they're highly utilising service users. On the child's 18th birthday, most, if not all of the support, their respite service, their support groups, it all disappears. The money as well, gone. Boof, poof. And nobody seems to want to support older autistic teenagers and young autistic adults. I guess they're just not cute anymore, right? Now, I understand how the parents of those people must feel. But the thing is, a lot of this frustration gets directed at autistic adults. And I've been told online quite a lot that, well, you shouldn't need an autism diagnosis because it should have been obvious as a child. And the thing is, I had a really shit time growing up. My only saving grace is that my flavour of autism, if you want to call it that, is what society chooses to accept and validate. I have useful skills as a result of my obsessive interests, and society paid me well for them. I love what Pier Novelli said in his book, that if he wasn't a successful comedian, he would be, and I quote, a problem for society to solve. What if instead of my hyper-focusing on software development, it was on the history of the Vikings, or what if it was just about cats? When I worked for Cats Protection and for a local SPCA, I spent thousands of hours. I didn't get paid for it. In fact, I often volunteered when I should have been working, like on my day job. I'm self-employed, obviously. My life suffered because of my interests. And while I'm here, this whole levels thing, especially on groups that try to gatekeep autism diagnoses, they will sometimes have badges for the level of autism that they have. Level 1s versus level 2s versus level 3s. It's like levels in a video game, a hierarchy, if you will. Maybe these levels unlock certain magic spells or something. Maybe that's where the telepathy is, level 4 autism. But it's entirely situational. If I were in a residential care facility where other service users are screaming and shouting and banging things, maybe scratching and biting people, the staff trying to manage them, the staff just gossiping in little huddles like staff will do, the smell of other people's food, their toileting, a strict schedule imposed on me because of organisational priorities, not my own ones, not being able to leave without somebody chaperoning me or getting permission. I mean, did anyone get the memo that autistic people often enjoy being alone sometimes? Let's just say the thermostat is set too hot or cold. Maybe I would be treated like some sort of hostage. And then maybe then I would be a level 3 too. No. I reckon I would get to level 4 autism. It would be a problem for society to solve. The level number is shorthand for the management of support and billing. It's very American. It's as American as apple pie, right? My formal diagnosis does not have a number. Like many of the countries that primarily use the World Health Organization's ICD, or International Classification of Diseases, instead of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I'm not trying to take anyone's number away from them. I'm not reaching through my screen and peeling off somebody's autism medals. And God forbid, I'm not trying to invalidate anyone on my channel. Nobody is gatekeeping here. There's no pot of amazing autism gold that we all have to fight and compete with each other for resources, you know? In my Discord community, the Scratching Post, you don't need to be autistic to join. The only thing you need is to be kind and to be one of my patrons. In fact, autistic community is the best thing that I didn't realise that I missed my entire life. Look, since starting my YouTube channel late 2023, I've met some amazing new friends and I learned a lot. In fact, I'm currently transitioning away from software development to YouTube, which is really, really scary because you'll see more YouTube videos from me. The purpose of diagnosis. I've waffled a lot today, so let's do a quick summary. The goal should be support, not gatekeeping who is really autistic or who deserves a diagnosis. A formal diagnosis can be essential if you need workplace or school accommodations, disability benefits, to be able to enforce legal protections, to correct a previous misdiagnosis, or peace of mind and personal validation. But there's no easy way to say this, it's no one else's business why you might choose to pursue or not pursue a diagnosis. It is no one's business. It's not parents of autistic children on Facebook. It's not strangers in gatekeeping Reddit communities. The reality is, self-identification always comes before a formal diagnosis. Every single diagnosed autistic person first recognized something different, maybe something off in themselves before seeking an assessment. Some people stop there, and that's fine. It's very fine. A formal diagnosis is a tool, but it shouldn't be placed on a pedestal as the only valid way to understand autism. And if you're someone who disagrees with self-identification, but made it this far into the video, first of all, well done. And second, let's just be real for a second. If the diagnostic system was more accessible, fewer people would need to self-identify without a formal assessment. So if you're gatekeeping who counts as autistic, you're really just reinforcing the same broken system that pushes people towards self-identification in the first place. Self-diagnosis is a complex, necessary conversation, but it all comes down to one thing. Support should be the priority. Fix your environment, or fix the supports that allow you to exist in unsuitable environments. If you're curious about the pros and cons of formal diagnosis, I have made 2 videos on the topic. They're in the description below and they're worth watching next. Or if you're feeling up for something a little neurospicy, watch my Profound Autism video where I talk about why some people think only severely autistic people matter. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.